Hello, everyone. My name's Brody, and on today's episode of Brody's Learning Adventure, we'll be learning about expansionism and imperialism. Alongside progressivism, while old ideas persisted. These ideas included manifest destiny, even though it seemed as though there was nowhere left for Americans to spread. The continental U.S. had taken shape following the Gadsden Purchase, but some Americans advocated expanding overseas. In Europe, imperialism was at its height as European powers took over nations in Asia and Africa. Imperialism is the policy of gaining authority over other nations or of acquiring colonies. Many Americans believed that imperialism would bring prosperity and prestige to the U.S. and would allow Americans to spread Western ideals. Since Washington's farewell address, the U.S. had steered clear of foreign problems, as Washington had advised, but its agenda was about to change. Social dwarfism was a major factor in imperialism. It was a popular idea that technologically advanced societies should rule over and control less advanced societies. Alaska. Shortly after the Civil War, Secretary of State William Seward purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. Considering how cold Alaska was, many people considered this a foolish purchase, calling it Seward's folly and referring to Alaska as Seward's icebox. As it turned out, Alaska was rich with natural resources, and the U.S. officially annexed it in 1884. The U.S. in the Pacific. The U.S. was becoming increasingly interested in the Pacific to open foreign markets to trade and American business interests. In 1854, Commodore Matthew Perry, and not the Commodore 64, used a combination of gifts and threats to convince Japan to enter into trade relations with the U.S. Japan would enter into trade with the U.S. Japan was beginning a period of major modernization, and trade was seen as lucrative. In 1864, the U.S. annexed the Midway Islands midway between America and Asia, where American ships could stop en route. Still, the U.S. wanted even more of a presence in the Pacific. Hawaii. Since about the beginning of the 19th century, the Hawaiian Islands, which were unified, have been a source of sugar for the U.S. Most of the sugar planters were Americans who had moved there and forced the King of Hawaii to grant them political power. In 1891, Queen Liliuokalani came to power and attempted to limit American influence. At about the same time, Congress imposed tariffs on imports of Hawaiian sugar, angering the planters. In 1893, planters staged a revolt with the help of the U.S. Marines and the U.S. ambassador to Hawaii, forming their own government. The new government asked to be annexed by the U.S. President Benjamin Harrison agreed, but the treaty he signed was not ratified before he left office. President Cleveland, who succeeded him, opposed annexation without the support of the Hawaiian people. It wasn't until 1900, during President McKinley's administration, that Hawaii became a territory for the U.S. In 1899, the U.S. annexed part of Samoa, a group of islands 2,500 miles south of Hawaii, or 2,500 for you guys who like to say the 500, like 3,500 or 3,500. The open door policy. In the second half of the 1800s, European nations and Japan convinced the weaker nation of China to grant them spheres of influence, or areas within China to control. Since the U.S. didn't have a sphere of influence there, in 1899, Secretary of State John Hay suggested an open door policy of equal access for multiple imperial powers, including the U.S., to trade with China. There wasn't any reason for the other nations nations to agree until the Boxer Rebellion of 1900, in which an anti-foreign secret society known as the Boxers killed a number of foreigners living in China. Once the Boxers were defeated, the imperial powers agreed to Hayes's policy and cooperated with one another. However, Japan soon began ignoring the policy, which started the Russo-Japan War, or the Russo-Japanese War, with Russia. The Treaty of Portsmouth of 1905 ended the Russo-Japanese War, but Japan had become an even greater power, and U.S.-Japanese tensions began to rise. Here's a quiz to see if you've been paying attention. What were the major arguments for imperialism in the U.S.? What was Seward's folly? How did Commodore Perry convince Japan to enter into trade relations with the U.S.? Why did the U.S. want territories in the Pacific in the late 1800s? Who was Queen Lilaukalani? Why did President Cleveland oppose President Harrison's plan to annex Hawaii? What is a sphere of influence, and what convinced other nations to agree to an open-door policy with China? Pause the video now to think of the answers for yourself. On to the answers. 1. People wanted to spread Western ideals, open trade, and increase the prestige of the U.S. 2. Secretary of State William Seward purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. Most people at the time thought there was nothing but cold up there, so they called the move Seward's folly. 3. Commodore Perry used a combination of gifts and threats to convince Japan to enter into trade relations with the U.S. 4. U.S. ships needed a place to stop on their way to trade with Japan. 5. Queen Lilaukalani was the Queen of Hawaii, who tried to limit American influence. 6. President Cleveland exposed annexion without the support of the Hawaiian people. 7. Area of control. And 8. The Boxer Rebellion of 1900 convinced other nations to agree to an open-door policy with China. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so that way you won't miss any of my new episodes. This is Brody signing out.